Axis powers won World War II, how would history have been rewritten? Let's dive into an alternate timeline that could have changed everything. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 marked a monumental shift in global geopolitics, with the Allies defeating the Axis powers and the world embarking on a new era of reconstruction, ideological division, and the Cold War. However, the possibility of an alternate outcome, where the Axis emerged victorious, presents a complex and unsettling vision of history. In this reimagined scenario, where the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy achieve military success, the world would have been drastically different, with profound effects on politics, society, culture, and the global balance of power. The Axis victory, a new world order. The first and most glaring change would have been the creation of a totalitarian-dominated global order. In this alternate timeline, Nazi Germany's vision of a new order in Europe would have been realized. Adolf Hitler's expansionist ambitions, which were partially thwarted by the entry of the United States into the war, and the resilience of the Soviet Union, would have likely continued unchecked. The concept of Lebensraum, the idea that Germans had a right to expand eastward, would have meant the annexation of vast portions of Eastern Europe and the eventual subjugation of the Soviet Union. The mass extermination of Slavic populations, as envisioned by Nazi ideology, would have escalated, turning Eastern Europe into a region of widespread genocide and destruction. If Nazi Germany had succeeded in its quest for domination, the entirety of Europe could have been reorganized under Nazi rule. A puppet regime in Britain, led perhaps by a collaborationist figure, might have replaced the British government, while nations such as France, the Netherlands, and Belgium would have been subjected to harsh occupation and integration into the Greater German Reich. The ideology of the Nazis, focused on Aryan supremacy, anti-Semitism, and authoritarian control, would have become the cornerstone of European civilization, with millions of Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and other marginalized groups continuing to suffer the brutal consequences of Hitler's racial policies. Meanwhile, the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini in Italy could have become a dominant force in the Mediterranean, with Italian control extending into North Africa and beyond. The fate of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, faced significant challenges on the Eastern Front during World War II, but had it not been for the resilience of the Soviet people and their eventual victory at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Axis powers would have likely been able to push eastward into Soviet territory. A German victory in Russia would have crippled Soviet communism and left Eastern Europe to be absorbed into the Nazi-controlled realm. In this alternate world, Stalin's regime could have been overthrown, replaced by pro-German or Nazi-aligned leadership. The Soviet Union, with its vast resources and industrial capacity, would have been either dismantled or turned into a subjugated colony. The spread of communism across the world would have been severely curtailed, and the ideological divide between the West and the East, symbolized by the Cold War, would have never taken place. Without the Soviet Union's influence, communist movements across Asia, Europe, and the Americas might have been either stunted or crushed. Imperial Japan and the Pacific. Across the Pacific, the vision of Imperial Japan to dominate Asia would have been realized, with catastrophic consequences for the region. Japan's militaristic expansion had already devastated China, Korea, and Southeast Asia during the war. Had Japan won the war, it could have cemented its dominance over these regions through continued military campaigns, effectively establishing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a Japanese-led imperial zone that would stretch from the Pacific Islands to China, Southeast Asia, and beyond. In this scenario, the brutality of Japanese occupation would have escalated as Japan imposed its cultural and political will on its conquered territories. Countries such as China and Korea would have been subjected to violent suppression, with millions of people either enslaved or brutally murdered. Japan's military strategy was characterized by cruelty, and its victory would have likely meant the complete eradication of resistance in its occupied territories. Moreover, the continued dominance of Imperial Japan in the Pacific would have meant that Australia and New Zealand could have fallen under Japanese influence, if not outright occupation. The The United States, having been defeated in the Pacific, would likely be isolated, its dominance in the Western Hemisphere unchallenged but severely weakened on the global stage. The United States in a post-Axis world. The United States' role in a world where the Axis won would have been dramatically reduced. While the United States would still be a significant power in the Western Hemisphere, it would have been isolated from global events. The lack of involvement in European and Asian affairs would have left the US to focus on its internal matters, its economy, politics, and potentially even civil rights issues that might have developed differently without the unifying force of its global competition. In this altered timeline, the United States could have faced internal political instability. With no pressing external enemies, the government might have been more inward-focused, and the economic boom that followed World War II could have been stunted. The absence of the Cold War would have deprived America of its ideological battle against communism, possibly leading to less support for international alliances and greater domestic political fragmentation. Resistance and repression. In the absence of Allied victory, resistance movements in occupied territories would have faced an uphill battle. Without the support of allies, many underground movements might have been crushed by Axis forces, and the harsh repression that followed would have made survival increasingly difficult. The atrocities committed by the Nazis and the Japanese would have only intensified, as there would be no external pressure to stop them. The legacy of resistance, whether in Europe, Asia, or even within the United States, would have been far more subdued, as any hope for liberation would have been extinguished. The collapse of democracy. Across the world, democratic movements could have been wiped out or severely weakened. Nazi Germany's vision of authoritarian rule could have inspired other nations to adopt fascism as a model for governance. In such a world, democracy would have become a rare and radical notion, with power concentrated in the hands of a few elite regimes. The United States itself, potentially in a more isolationist role, might have been the last holdout for liberal democracy, but even here, there could have been pressure to adapt to the new global paradigm of totalitarianism. The cultural and social fallout. Culturally, a world under Axis rule would have seen the suppression of free expression, intellectual freedom, and human rights. Artistic movements and scientific inquiry would have been tightly controlled, with the regime enforcing ideological conformity. The Nazi regime, for example, was notorious for its repression of art, music, and literature that didn't conform to its narrow view of the world. In this dystopian society, any form of dissent or deviation from the official ideology could have been punishable by death, and intellectual life would have been stifled. Moreover, the racial and social hierarchies espoused by the Nazis and the Japanese Empire would have shaped every aspect of life. The systemic oppression of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and other minorities would have continued unchecked, leaving a brutal legacy of inequality. A world in which the Axis powers won World War II would have been a world of pervasive totalitarianism where freedom and democracy were distant dreams crushed by the weight of fascism and imperialism. It would have been a world where genocide, racial purity, and militarianism defined the political landscape. The social, economic, and cultural fabric of nations across the globe would have been permanently altered by the dominance of the Axis. The history of the 20th century, so often defined by the fight against totalitarianism, would have instead been one of submission to it, with humanity trapped under the boot of fascist oppression. While this alternate history may seem unimaginable, it's a stark reminder of how fragile our freedoms are and how the choices of today shape the world of tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking explorations.